Hello students, welcome back for Learning Unit number 2. In this video lecture we're going to cover off episodes 3 and 4 of the Justice with Michael Sandel video lecture series. And this is a fun lecture. I'm going to cover a fun story, which is something which I hope really illustrates in American terms and very current terms what we're going to be talking about today. And that will help you do your Sunday summary. We're also going to cover off once again how to do your Sunday summary. I know last week you probably had a lot of questions. It was the first time you've probably done anything like this because no other professors do this kind of an assignment. And so this week, after this video, I'm going to have another video compiled of what you all submitted, and that should help you prepare your Sunday summary for week number 2. So let's get started with some introductions. A lot of you have sent in your selfie, so now I can introduce you to Brisha, Derek, Shireen, Kizzy, Matt, Dauchlin, Marina, Sarah. That's just the first 9. Here's Anna Maria, Dan, Andrew, Brooke, Kiki, Delmar, Sarah, Jalais, Samantha. That's the second 9. We're actually at 28 students in the class now. There's only 3 on this last frame. I'm still waiting for a few pictures. So Benjamin doesn't have a picture, but here's Mei Lee. William doesn't have a picture. David doesn't have a picture. Victoria does. Combrell does not have a picture. Cheryl does. I hope I picked the right picture for you, Cheryl. The picture you said had 3 people in it, but this was my best guess. And Robert didn't get a picture, and Shaniqua did not get a picture either. So if I murdered some of your names, it's because I speak fluent Spanish and English, and so I kind of Spanglishize most names when I have to shoot off the cuff. So I appreciate your pictures. If I got any of the pictures wrong, please send me a little email and saying you put the wrong name under my picture, because these are what I'm going to be using when you send submissions, so that each of you can kind of get to know each other, and this will spare you having to do the arduous ordeal of discussion threads on Blackboard, which I didn't enjoy in any of my 6 years of full-time studies here, and from what I hear, none of you have enjoyed doing them in previous classes either. So for this week, you should have already watched, or you will be watching very soon, episode 3 and episode 4 of the Justice with Michael Sandel video series. Once again, I'm just going to quickly go over how I do my notes so that you can learn and perhaps borrow a little bit of what I do for yourselves. In episode 3, part 1, I made this many notes, and here's my minute marks. And we talked about all of these points here. So this one here we covered very carefully John Stuart Mills, as well as the modern economist Robert Nozick, who's also a professor at Harvard with Michael Sandel. We talked about Bill Gates and Michael Jordan and how much they probably object to taxes that they have to pay. He went into depth on the libertarian view of government, and he mentioned these 3 points about the libertarian view, that there should be no paternalistic legislation. Government is not your father, it's not your parent. So there should be no morals legislation as well, which really kind of flies in the face of how the conservatives argue for abortion, the bans on abortion, and how they've argued and spent billions of dollars trying to hold the same-sex marriage bans in place. But they don't have to make sense because this is politics. So politics doesn't have to make sense. It just has to be something which somebody can advance if they have enough money or if they have enough power. But that's another lecture entirely. And the third point for the libertarian point of view is that there should be no redistribution of income from the rich to the poor. And he went into a lot of detail about why that should be. Here's his graph on the income inequality in the United States. And from a libertarian perspective, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. What Nozick made very clear is that before you can argue that unequal income distribution is still just, is that in the first place there was justice in acquisition, so somebody didn't steal it to get it, and there's justice in transfer, which means that there were no imbalances in the forces in the market forces. So you didn't have a monopoly, for example. So we can argue very, very strongly under Nozick that the robber barons of the late 1800s and the early 1900s violated point number 2 here. They earned their income according to history because Rockefeller had the oil and all of the Railroads were built by these individuals. In many cases they built their own roads because nobody else had as much money as they did. But it wasn't just in transfer. They violated the just in transfer part of this law because they had monopolies, and you could not buy from anybody else. So there was a hyperinflated transfer price in the markets at that point in time because it was not a free market. They had controlled the markets. So you can argue that those people absolutely should have had their income redistributed. And now we are poor, essentially. There are generations of individuals who are poor 100, 120 years later because of the dynamics that were put into play a century ago that have carried through to today. So that's just some of the arguments that you're going to find out about, but I'm complicating what the lecture was. I'm just adding on to what Michael Sandel placed on his points. Nozick's arguments against taxation, I'm not going to go into much detail here because you should have paid attention, or if you did not understand it, you can go back and rewatch it on Michael Sandel's videos. Episode 3, Part 2, Who Owns Me? That was a very good argument about whether we are free agents unto ourselves. And there was a lot of argument in there, I like this point here, using some people for the sake of other people's welfare. That was a very strong argument about who owns me. And when you violate that sense of self. I love the story about the Salem Fire Corporation. A lot of you probably remember that story when the fire department went and watched an individual's house burn down because he didn't pay a $75 assessment. That's where it goes when you have a libertarian, pure libertarian economy, because they don't want to have government do things for them. So if there's enough people that want to have a fire department, they should just get together and have their own fire corporation. They pay their dues to it. And if you don't want fire protection, you don't have to pay your dues. But in a corporate environment, if you're not part of the club, you don't get any of the benefits of the club. Objections to libertarianism is that the poor do need the money more. Taxation by consent of the governed is not coerced. And the successful owe a debt to society, and the wealth depends partly on luck, so it isn't deserved. These are very good arguments, and so this is where Michael Sandel left us at the end of episode 3, and then he starts the argument of John Locke and how Locke improves that argument of libertarianism. Episode 4, part 1, started into this idea of answering the question why we cannot give up our own right to a proprietary self. So an unalienable right means that we can't even give it up if we wanted to. We can't sell ourselves into slavery. We can't give up our freedom. It's unalienable. It's part and parcel of who we are. And Locke also starts to argue at this point in time that property, any kind of property, even if it's our property that we put our labor into a product that somebody else sold, gives us an entitlement to what that other person sold because our labor went into it. And that's a very strong argument if you take it to a natural conclusion, but so far we haven't gone there, but we will. So this is where episode 4, part 1 went to. This is my land, and Locke started arguing about the property idea, very, very in depth, and he started expanding that. Now, you've got to remember, and Michael Sandel talks about this, and this is going to be very important to my argument later about where I'm going to go with my example of a Sunday summary this week, is that Native Americans did not enclose their land, so they did not own it in Locke's estimation, because they were hunters and gatherers. In Canada we call them First Nations people, and I think that's a more apt name for them because they had a nation before we got here. In world history, the winners get to write the history. And so as part of our American education system, we were taught that we colonized the United States and that it was land here and it was free for the taking because Native Americans didn't actually claim any of it, they were just kind of using it. They were like tenant farmers, and so we can put them on reservations because there was more land than they needed anyway. So why don't we give them all the deserts and we'll take all this fertile land over here because it's more convenient that way. So this was how unfair we were to the Native Americans. But John Locke was writing at this period in time, and he was writing for the white Europeans. And he needed to justify, perhaps, and this is what Sandel argues, is that perhaps Locke needed to justify in his own mind that why they were just and fair in claiming all of this land that had already been claimed by the Native Americans, in the sense that they were part and parcel of the earth. And so they couldn't own the earth because the earth could not be owned in their view of the world. And so it would have been obscene and it would have been improper for them to actually lay claim to any part of Mother Earth and to the animals. And this was their culture. But Europeans didn't understand that, so you know what, they're heathens. We can just keep sending them over the Mississippi until we need that land, and then we'll take it from them when we get there as well. So this is what John Locke was trying to argue in his mind, and so you have to have kind of a tongue-in-cheek approach to his idea of property and claiming it and enclosing it, because it served his purpose at that point in time. But if you eliminate the idea of how unjust it was to Native Americans, it makes a good argument, and that's where I want you to go when you're thinking about Michael Sandel's video. Eventually, as John Locke represented the government, John Locke was saying to his audience that, you know what, property rights are very, 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 very important, but at the same time, if you have elected a government by a democratic process, then you concede to the government their right to define what property is. So property is unalienable, but the government gets to define it because we elected the government. And so it's this very circular logic. And it's getting a little inconvenient, but that's what philosophy is all about. It's like chewing gum for the brain when you get into this kind of a philosophy. So the state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which obliges everyone. And reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind who will but consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. This is where Locke sets himself up for a really awkward argument. Every man has a property in his own person. This nobody has right to but himself. The labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are property his. For this labor, being the unquestionable property of the laborer, no man but he can have a right to what is once joined to, at least where there is enough, and as good left in common for others. Episode 4, Part 2, is the sealing argument for John Locke. It seals it and ties it up nicely and puts a bow on it. It's his second big idea, the powers of a legitimate government founded on consent. This is where you're actually setting up this government that gets to define what property is. It's inconvenient to Locke. He doesn't call it it's not a deal breaker in his mind, it's just inconvenient to Locke that everybody can enforce laws in the state of nature. It means everyone is insecure in their enjoyment, because if a bear comes onto your property to eat your cattle, you're entitled to kill the bear. And John Locke's argument is, if another man comes onto your property to steal your cattle, you're equally justified in killing the man. Because property rights are unalienable. Nobody can take your property from you, and if they try to, then you can use force and deadly force if necessary to do that. And Locke just calls this inconvenient. And by the same rights, Locke argues that even the government can't take that property from you. But don't forget, there's this little footnote at the bottom that says the government gets to define what property is. But in the pure argument of philosophy here, government does not even have a right to take your property from you, because property is that unalienable right. For the preservation of property being the end of government, and that for which men enter into society, it necessarily supposes and requires that people should have property. So this is Locke's idea of what comes together and creates society, is this coalition of individuals who have their property and want to get together somehow, some way, to protect their property in a collaborative effort. And so you got to remember, Locke's arguments are 200 years old. Things weren't quite then what they are now, but we're still trying to build off of this Locke argument because this is what gave birth to what we do have now in society. This idea of what's just and fair. What society has to admit, and what Locke argues, is that governments cannot be supported without great charge. And it is fit everyone who enjoys his share of the protection should pay out of his estate his proportion for the maintenance of it. This goes back to that argument of the Fire Protection Corporation, where, yeah, you can live independently on your property, but if you want to have a fire engine in your neighborhood, then you need to get together with your neighbors and buy the fire engine and have a volunteer fire department organized, have somebody lead it. So you're supposed to pay that out of your pocket. It's part of your contribution in order to belong to this society. But it still must be with his own consent, namely the consent of the majority, because that's how we formed the society. We created this democratic process, giving it either by themselves or their representatives chosen by them. And this is where we come back to that circular argument of, we voted them in, now we're going to give them, legislature, the right to define what property is. Okay, so that was the extent of the episode 3 and episode 4. So now it's time for us to start thinking about what you're going to put in for your Sunday summary. I've changed the page a little bit, the folder for Sunday summary. So if you're right here, link into it, you'll now see that there is probably January 11th has been taken off because you're probably watching this after Monday morning. And so now we have January 18th, which is Sunday summary number 2. But you'll also notice this little page up here, this folder for the file folder. And I'll tell you what that is as part of my lecture here. So remember, first thing you have to do when you're going to do your Sunday summary is you're going to take your notes, where you should have made just bullet points or something to that effect. Here are my bullet points, the way I compiled them. Episode 3, Part 1, Episode 3, Part 2, Episode 4, Part 1, and Episode 4, Part 2. Now, if I compiled them all together and put them together on a cover sheet, that would be what I hand in with my Sunday summary. And then I would circle the points that I'm going to talk about in my YouTube video or my audio clip. Now, if you're going to go with a 2-page summary, then you don't have to do this. You just have to kind of expand this into 2 pages of prose so that you can summarize in your own words what was covered off in the lectures. But if you're going to do the shorter, quicker version and do a multimedia component, all you need to do is bring your notes together on a single page, circle what you're going to talk about, and that's part 1. And I'm going to talk about today, and the way I'm going to show what I would have put together this week for my Sunday summary, I'm going to talk about the Clive and Bundy fiasco, which happened in April of 2014. This is an article out of the Washington Post, so my hyperlink would be included in this Sunday summary to this article. And what it was a case of Clive and Bundy burst into the national news cycle over the past week, captivating conservative media outlets with its protagonist, a firm believer of states' rights with an armed group of supporters backing him. So we need to go back here to the points that I circled. And this is where John Locke was arguing that it was inconvenient that everyone can enforce laws in the state of nature. So if it's government land, then it's everybody's land, and if it's not enclosed, then everybody should be able to use it, and so it becomes part of common property. And Clive closest to it, so he gets to use it, and everybody else that's closest to it gets to use it. It's kind of unfortunate that the people in Tennessee
can't put their cattle to graze on this land in Nevada, but that's just unlucky for them. So Clive and Bundy doesn't own the property, but because it's not owned by anybody else, Clive and Bundy thinks his cattle should be able to walk on it. But the government has an interest in it, and the government has claimed an interest in it, and we'll talk about that, and that's what this story is all about. What came of this is that Clive and Bundy has a lot of people supporting his ideals and his ideology, and so there was this huge standoff when the Bureau of Land Management came in to try and collect this $1 million debt that Clive and Bundy owes the government by taking his cattle, because he wasn't going to pay them, so they seized his property. And all of these other states' rights individuals came flying down from central Idaho and Montana and everywhere else where there's no respect for federal government, and they brought their guns, and that's what came of this episode. But how did it all start? So I want to take you for my 2-minute lecture here. Remember, I did my 2-minute audio clip, pretending I'm doing my PowerPoint or my audio clip, as you would do your Sunday summary here. So I'm going to take you back to 1989, when the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service listed the desert tortoise as an endangered species. Now, government has a vested interest, and we have established by elected democratic process the idea that we need to protect certain individuals, certain species, because if we start allowing species to go extinct, then we're going to damage a very, very delicate ecosystem. And so it's very important to not allow species to go extinct. The desert tortoise was being endangered by livestock grazing on this land.
So that was where the problem started in 1989. 1995, by the 1995, they started to enforce this. And Thursday evening in April 1995, a small bomb goes off at the U.S. Forest Service office in Carson City, Nevada. So we have this conflict between the government trying to claim this property and other individuals say it's nobody's property, government doesn't have any right to it, and now we have this standoff. The Bureau of Land Management oversees 7 million acres of land in Nevada. Nevada is 85% owned by the federal government. Primarily because nobody else wanted it, nobody could farm on it. But the desert tortoise loved it, and there is enough on it to graze cattle. There's just not enough to have intensive farming on it. So you couldn't make a living on it if you owned it. But because there is stuff there for cattle to eat, people turn their cattle loose on it. And that's what Clive and Bundy did. Lots and lots and lots of cattle for 20 years. So by 1996, the federal government had 2 more pipe bombs explode in the Bureau of Land Management, and they challenged Clive and Bundy in court, and he defended himself because he doesn't recognize the federal government. So he went to court in the Ninth Circuit, Supreme Court, the Appeals Circuit, and he lost because he represented himself, and he was basically out there just saying that he doesn't recognize the government. Why should he even have to defend himself? Because this is not a legitimate authority, that he didn't even recognize it. So he went to court basically to say that, and of course he lost. Cliff Gardner was another violent person with Clive and Bundy. It's notable that the Bundy family are Mormons, and that was when he got to that area of Nevada. It was in the 1800s, mid-1800s, when the Mormons settled Utah. His family went down and settled this area. So that's Clive and Bundy's claim, is he's been there as long as Mormons have been on the other side of the Mississippi River. So the Bureau of Land Management put up the signs and said no trespassing, especially you, Clive and Bundy. People would go in and they would chainsaw the signs down because, once again, they're still not recognizing anybody has authority over this common land. It's unclaimed land. And so by April 2012, the Bureau of Land Management was starting to figure out how they could claim Clive and Bundy's cattle. They wanted to round up his cattle. But there was this threat of violence, and it was basically the Wild West out there. And so the Bureau of Land Management individuals didn't want to go out there because there was a lot of threats that there would be harm done to them. I mean, they've had pipe bombs going off in their offices. The Bureau of Land Management boss is very unpopular now with the Republican governor of Nevada. And the Bureau of Land and the governor of Nevada is basically asking him to resign because he's not doing popular things. Well, he's not doing popular things with the Republicans, and it's a Republican governor, and everybody's kind of tired of hearing the argument about the land tortoise. But the idea of managing land and properly managing land in the idea of the government is that this ecosystem is important, and we can't just be belligerent in how we deal with the ecosystem, and especially when it's only benefiting 1 or 2 individuals who live and have proximity to this land. So Clive and Bundy was enriching himself, and a very few other individuals were enriching themselves. And so it's not like everybody in the United States was benefiting, but they would benefit if we protected the environment and these endangered species. And so that was in the best interest of the United States, but these individuals are not recognizing the federal government. They're states' rights activists. So they claim to not have any, they claim that the federal government is not a legitimate authority in the first place. So by August, a court order says Bundy has 45 days. By March 2014, long past the 45-day deadline, after nearly 20 years, the Bureau of Land Management sends Bundy a letter informing him that they plan to impound his trespassing cattle. Now, you've got to understand, there's a lot of cattle there. It's going to cost the federal government, the Bureau of Land Management, about $1 million to round up his cattle. And they're going to sell this cattle for about $1 million, so because he owes them $1 million. But by the time they have rounded up the cattle, they're also going to owe him the cost of rounding up his cattle because they did his work for him. So the bill's going to be $2 million, and they're not even going to sell the amount of cattle they sell is not even going to come close to doing that. But they have no other recourse against Clive and Bundy. And Clive and Bundy is saying, well, there are going to be 500,000 less hamburgers in the United States next year because I'm not going to be able to graze my cattle. And these cattle are very important because I'm generating food for Americans. And all they're thinking about is the tortoise. He says, now, the tortoise is a fine creature, but he says, we can share the land. Well, for 20 years they've been saying, no, you can't share the land, and statistically they're showing that tortoises don't fare very well in a head-to-head battle against grazing cattle. So anyways, by April 10th, this is when the militia, I'm over my 2 minutes now, I need you to also be careful of this. So that's one reason why I did this. I did this deliberately, because I wanted you to see how easy it is to go over 2 minutes. So I've gone on for too long. And so I could have come straight to this point here. By April of 2014, the militia all descended down on the Clive and Bundy Bureau of Land Management neighborhood, and they put up a sign that said, Milita sign in. Well, I guess if you don't recognize federal rights, you probably don't recognize public schools either, right? So who knows where they learned to spell, but obviously whoever wrote the sign was not very good at it. But anyways, they came from as far away as Montana, as close as St. George. A lot of people came down, and they set up camp, and they were ready and prepared to go to war with the Bureau of Land Management because they were that vehement about their rights. This is what John Locke is arguing, and this is the danger that we have when we start talking about property without some kind of leavening in the loaf. So you've got to have something that mitigates this kind of a conflict, and that's what the next few episodes of the Justice with Michael Sandel video are all about. So anyways, the government conceded. They left the cattle. They left because, let's face it, they were outnumbered. They didn't want to have some kind of Waco, Texas standoff again, which was another very good example that you could have pulled from on this argument of libertarianism and John Locke. But they didn't want to have another Waco, Texas, so they backed off, and the Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid said, this is not over. We cannot have an American people that violate the law and then just walk away from it. But it's now January 2015. Clive and Bundy is still grazing cattle on the federal lands in Nevada. And this is far from settled. Now that's pretty rough, because John Locke died in 1704. So we have been arguing this nonstop ever since the late 1600s. And we're still no closer to resolving this kind of a battle, because there are such strong arguments on both sides. And this is where philosophy will always be very, very important. And you got to understand these philosophical camps, because you can't just choose one side and say, oh, okay, it's all over because I picked this side. There will always be somebody on the other side. So once again, when you're doing your Sunday summary, these are the 4 questions you need to answer. Who was hurt by this decision? Who benefited unfairly by this decision? What made this decision unfair or unjust or unethical? And how could or how did or how might government intervene this time, next time, and in the future? Once again, the instructions for doing your Sunday summary are in the syllabus, but a little bit more help. I have created, as I mentioned earlier, a new teaching template for you to use, and it's in the folder where you upload your Sunday summaries. It's the very top document. It's a Word document that you can just download. For part 1, you start typing in your own notes. For part 2, part 3, part 4, and part 5. And I put those 4 questions down here at the bottom to help you. So if you download this template, which is in the Sunday Summaries folder, that may help you if you're going to do the YouTube or the audio clip. And once again, if you're doing a 2-page summary rather than the multimedia component, you just upload your 2-page summary. If you're going to do a YouTube or if you're going to do an audio file, the YouTube, just send me the hyperlink in your Word document and upload it here on the Sunday Summary upload page. And if you're going to do an audio file, text it to me from your cell phone, or if you record it on your computer, you can attach it as well as you upload the document. But I need a Word document so that I have a hyperlink to go to, so that I can actually read the article that you're going to be expanding on with your 2-minute mini lecture. We'll call it a mini lecture. I appreciate that. That's the end of this week's video, and I look forward to seeing the topics that you choose in your Sunday summaries.